So the Supreme Court recently denied emergency relief in 2 cases which are trying to stop the Illinois rifle and magazine ban. However, there is one case out there that no one's talking about that could actually stop the registration deadline that's coming in January. So let's talk about what is happening. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think this rifle and magazine ban and mandatory registration is clearly a violation of the Second Amendment, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Also, I want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Blackout Coffee. Blackout Coffee has amazing coffee and they're huge Second Amendment supporters. They have dedicated roasts for organizations like FBC and GOA. So if you want to get great coffee and support the 2A cause, I cannot recommend Blackout Coffee enough. You can check them out using the links down below. And if you use the code ARMSCHOLAR, you can get 10% off of your order. So like I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about what is recently going on in the state of Illinois with the rifle and magazine ban and the upcoming registration deadline for these types of firearms, and then also parts as well. Recently, we received news that Supreme Court denied emergency relief in 2 cases. They denied 2 injunctions, which would have at least temporarily halted the statewide rifle and magazine ban because of this looming registration deadline. PICA only allows for the grandfathering of certain rifles and parts and magazines and things like that if the individuals in the state go through the registration process, if they file a notice with the state and register these items. But as of right now, I believe only like 8,000 firearms themselves have been identified with the state. And of course, that is with the millions of rifles and other items within the state of Illinois. So clearly people are not complying with this registration deadline. They're not complying with this. And it's really exposing a lot of people to potential liability and criminal conviction potentially because of this registration deadline that is coming up. Now, despite what the Supreme Court has recently done in some of these cases, the Colkins case and then the NAGR case, and despite what the 7th Circuit has recently done in denying en banc review in some of these other Illinois cases, there's one case out there that people are not really talking about. And this is actually the Federal Firearms Licensees of Illinois versus Pritzker. This is a lawsuit that was brought in conjunction with some 2A organizations, which are Gun Owners of America, so GOA, which is an awesome organization, their foundation, the Gun Owners Foundation, and then they are actually joining together with Michelle and Associates. So Michelle and Associates are actually the attorneys that are helping with this lawsuit. Now, if you don't know who Michelle and Associates are, they are the attorneys that handle most of the California Rifle and Pistol Association cases. They're an awesome law firm, and they are very versed in Second Amendment lawsuits. They are responsible for a lot of wins that we get here in the state of California when the state of California is sued because of their gun laws, including the gun control laws that they put in place, like the rifle bans, the magazine bans. CRPA and Michelle and Associates are responsible for engaging in a lot of those fights, and they've been very successful. So now you have this lawsuit, this FFL of Illinois versus Pritzker lawsuit that has Gun Owners of America in affiliation with Michelle and Associates, in some way kind of affiliated with CRPA. They are suing the state of Illinois, and the main thrust right now of this lawsuit and one of the main motions that they're seeking right now is also a preliminary injunction against the registration deadline that is coming up. What they are trying to do is get at least a preliminary injunction, a temporary halt on the enforcement of that registration deadline. Now, if you're not aware of what a preliminary injunction is simply a temporary halt on the enforcement of a law. It's a request to temporarily halt something from going into effect. And there are 4 main factors to get a preliminary injunction. The primary one being a likelihood of success on the merits. And then the second one is proving that you will suffer some sort of irreparable harm if you don't get an injunction. And then the other ones is kind of a balancing of interests. What is in the public's best interest? Is it going to harm the public at large? Things like that. It's kind of a balancing test, but the main one always is a likelihood of success on the merits. Now, in this motion, one of the main things that they're arguing is that this law here, this registration process here, is a violation of due process because the state of Illinois did not provide residents and their gun owners proper notice of the new requirements that are in place, and they didn't provide enough notice in time so that people could actually go through the registration process and do what the state of Illinois wants them to do. And that would clearly be a violation of due process. So that's one of the main thrusts in this motion for a preliminary injunction. Also, some of their arguments are a little bit more nuanced, and I think this is because Michelle and Associates and Gun Owners of America and everybody involved with this specific lawsuit are very familiar with a lot of these bans on so-called assault weapons and so-called magazines or non-standard magazines. I don't even want to call them what they call them. But everybody involved in this lawsuit are very familiar because they've challenged various other bans on so-called assault weapons, rifles, magazines, and parts, things like that, because they brought lawsuits in states like California. And a lot of things that Illinois does and a lot of things that other states do are in some ways just copy and paste of what California has already done. So they're very familiar with this fight. And so they have a little bit more nuance in their arguments to try to stop what's happening in Illinois. Now, first, one of the interesting things that they're arguing is because how the Seventh Circuit is currently structured, some of this language, and the Seventh Circuit three-judge panel prior in some of these cases have found that these arms are not protected under the Second Amendment. They've alluded to something like that. What the Michel and Associates, I believe, has done here in their motion is they're arguing, well, yes, these are clearly arms protected by the Second Amendment, but then they also take the nuanced approach to say, well, even if you say the firearm maybe themselves isn't protected, these parts and your ability to build and configure firearms and do what you need to is clearly protected by the Second Amendment as well. This is conduct protected by the Second Amendment. And so that is a different approach that they're taking because of some of the things that the Seventh Circuit has already said in some of the other Illinois challenges. And then they actually look at the registration process itself so that they can challenge it and try to get an injunction against it. And again, one of the nuanced approaches that they're taking is that a lot of the language about the assault weapon parts and you having to identify your possession of assault weapon parts to have them going forward and register them with the state of Illinois, what they're pointing out here is that that section is overly vague and it doesn't actually tell people how to register these parts. And because of that vagueness, this court here, Judge McGlynn, should issue an injunction against that, because how could people ever comply with the registration process if they're not actually even sure what they need to do because the language is so vague and overbroad? In this section of their motion, they point out the variety of different language that the PICA and what Illinois is saying that needs to be identified with the state. They talk about how some things like barrel shrouds are in some way defined, but then some other things like a pistol grip being an assault weapon part and needing to be registered with the state, that is not clearly defined. Other things like collapsible stocks are not clearly defined. And I think here's where the knowledge of some other lawsuits and what other states have done and the experience in following these lawsuits really comes in handy, because here, Michel and Associates points out that a lot of these parts definitions are not clearly defined. And then when you look at other states who have passed laws, which even though those laws are unconstitutional, at least they tried to define and make it in some way clearer to people what types of items they are identifying. For example, in PICA, they talk about pistol grips, but they don't really identify what a pistol grip is. Now you compare that to California, and California has a very nuanced approach to how they say a certain part is a pistol grip. They have various regulations where they talk about the webbing of the hand if it goes below the action of a weapon, or a pistol grip being something that protrudes conspicuously beneath the action of a weapon. So at least California, even though it's unconstitutional in violation of the Second Amendment, at least they have some language and some sort of clarification on the parts that they are targeting. Illinois did not do any of that, and then at the same time, they're expecting people to understand what parts fall under this registration requirement and then register them with the state. And if they don't, then these people are subject to criminal penalties. And because of that, because of the vagueness, the due process, clear violations, the Second Amendment violations, they're asking for a motion for preliminary injunction. And in their motion, they state that this court should thus preliminarily enjoin Illinois' registration requirement for violating the Second Amendment, at least as to parts, but need not if it finds either of plaintiffs' other two claims sufficient basis to do so. Plaintiffs are sensitive to the complexities of deciding legal issues that are sub judice by a higher court. But Illinois imposed an unconstitutional registration mandate on an equally unconstitutional timeframe. Plaintiffs have no other choice but to seek relief now. But what all this is pointing to in the motion for preliminary injunction with GOA and Michel and Associates is that the precedent right now in the Seventh Circuit is not great. The outcome of the higher courts is not looking great, but with some nuanced arguments about parts, specifically the vagueness and due process issues, the Second Amendment violations, a lot of those well-nuanced arguments that they're very familiar with making because of the state of California. What they're arguing right now is, despite what has happened in the higher courts, this lower court judge here, Judge McGlynn, should still issue a preliminary injunction because of how significant and how a big of a burden that registration process is going to be on people and gun owners in the state of Illinois. So I wanted to put this on everybody's radar because a lot of people were not happy with the Supreme Court denying emergency relief in a bunch of those cases that went to the Supreme Court. But this is one of those cases that no one was talking about. I know a lot of the people over at Michelle & Associates. I'm very familiar with Gun Owners America and Gun Owners Foundation. This is one of those cases that is significant, that is trying to get a halt on the injunction. Oral arguments were already held in this earlier this month. And so right now we're just waiting for a decision from Judge McGlynn. Now, of course, if we get any more information, I will let you guys know. Also, if you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. So as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.